My name is Susannah. I'm in the Historical, Theoretical, and Critical Studies of Psychology program at York University. This graduate program is part of the larger program at York, the larger psychology program at York. And I think it's probably unusual, to have people from psychology at labor conferences. And this is because psychology usually falls under the disciplinary umbrella of the natural sciences rather than the social sciences, most often using quantitative methods and focusing on individuals and not social systems or structures. So as a critical psychologist, my work calls attention to this and shows how psychological research and practice is not value neutral, but is a handmaiden of capitalism, or in the words of Barrett, a servant of power. My previous research focused on critiques of therapeutic culture throughout the 20th century and the psychologization of both academic and everyday discourse. And I looked at how these processes were aligned with capitalism. So now, in the interest of joining my critique of psychology and therapeutic culture with my experience in labor organizing and unions, my research is focusing on psychology's role in workplaces in a subfield of what is called industrial organizational psychology, or IO psychology, which is itself a form of psychologization. And it's one of the first instances of psychology spreading itself outside of academia and into other domains. So before IO psychology, what was called industrial psychology arose in the early 20th century, shortly after psychology had broken off from philosophy and adopted the experimental methods and measurement techniques of the natural sciences. After Wilhelm Wundt's establishment of the first psychological laboratory in Leipzig in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, students of his started taking their knowledge and practices out of the lab and applying them in the real world. And this is one of the first instances of what we now call applied psychology. So factories were one of the first places that psychological expertise became desirable and valued. Much of this occurred in the US, as well as in the UK and some other European countries. And many key figures in the history of psychology worked in industrial settings. So although this was a common trend, it was also controversial. And some people argued that the application of psychology in workplaces was a degradation of the science. Oh, sorry, I missed that. This was the slide for that. I skipped over a slide by accident. Okay, sorry.
Sorry, I should have picked that up.
I did not. Okay, so here was my slide so far. I'll just go. So that was the first slide. Beginning of industrial organizational psychology, and now we're here. So psychologists were hired by owners, factory owners, to help make workplaces run more efficiently and increase productivity and profits. Psychological research at the time was focused on personality testing and individual difference research. Psychological interventions in workplaces often involved testing workers to match them to jobs that they would be best suited for. Psychologists such as Lillian Gilbreth and her engineer husband, Frank Gilbreth, worked directly alongside Friedrich Taylor to help implement the principles of scientific management, specifically in their time and motion studies. Psychologists typically thought of themselves as bringing a more humane perspective to scientific management by taking workers' needs and well-being into consideration. The field then grew over the 20th century, and the focus on worker well-being became more central, leading to the establishment of human resources departments in workplaces. The adding of the term organizational signifies a shift in focus from scientific management to topics like employee attitudes and motivation, group processes, supervision, and leadership. So in spite of the shift of focus to workers, throughout its history, IO psychologists have almost unilaterally been hired by and aligned with management and have rarely worked with unions or advocated for the labor movement. There have been some voices of critique of this along the way, although they have been relatively few. And the purpose of the first part of my dissertation is to examine those critiques and to provide a kind of a history of counter research in IO psychology. After looking at this historical context, my dissertation is going to analyze current trends in the field by examining whether studies on wage earners, gig workers, unions, or labor are found in popular journals in the field, as well as whether they are addressed in current textbooks. With the rise of the professional managerial class and white-collar work, Research and practice in IO psychology has been growing as well, with psychologists increasingly being hired as independent consultants for companies or working in HR departments. IO psychology is almost exclusively limited to these settings and has noticeably neglected both non-traditional forms of employment, including wage earners and gig workers, as well as unions and labor movements. And there's a study here that I've highlighted from Bergman and Jean from 2016, who analyzed the top journals in IO psychology, and shockingly found there is literally no studies on these non-traditional forms of employment. So they're just not addressing this huge sector of labor. I'm contributing to the critiques of this, I'm exploring from a Marxist perspective why this is the case, and envisioning roles psychologists could take on that would genuinely support labor. As a critical psychologist, I hold that psychological concepts do not represent natural categories in the world, but that psychological discourse and practice is constructed in particular ways alongside dominant social norms and ideologies. The question my research addresses is if and how IO psychology can be newly imagined in ways that might contribute to social transformation and the building of worker power. I argue that IO psychology can no longer remain value neutral or avoid questions of social context. A critical approach is required that takes the relationship between individuals and society to be the fundamental unit of analysis. So that's kind of just like an overview. I had just had my dissertation proposal approved, and I'm currently starting on the first chapter on the early history of IO psychology. So that's what I'm just going to discuss in a little bit more detail here. I'm first going to talk about some methodological considerations of the history chapter. I'll give a brief overview of some of the content I plan to include, and then I'm going to end with some kind of overarching questions that are guiding my research. I'm taking a critical historical approach, which can be contrasted with traditional history. So traditional histories are linear histories that depict a series of key events and figures and assume that we are progressing towards truth and an ever better society. Critical history, in contrast, in the tradition of Foucault, aims to show the contingency of social systems and categories that are taken for granted as natural and true. Historicizing contemporary knowledge and practices allows us to imagine how things might be otherwise. Critical histories have a destabilizing effect and open space for the creation of new systems that benefit those who may have been historically marginalized or disadvantaged. Critical histories can involve highlighting voices and perspectives that have previously been silenced or marginalized, as well as focusing on the social and political context in which important events occurred, in which the great men had their great ideas. And Nicholas Rose, he advocates for a Foucauldian approach in psychology to the critical history of in doing a critical history of the psi disciplines to show the socially constructed nature of psi discourse and practice. So I started my work on this chapter by reading a book by Andrew Vincher, 2018, on the early history of IO psychology. And Vincher states that he is taking a critical approach to history by combining the ideas and actions of key figures with external context. He presumes that real progress occurred, but with discontinuities and missteps along the way. While I appreciate Vincher's really well-researched and comprehensive work, he pays insufficient attention to the growth of the labor movement in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when over the course of the years, millions of workers in the US and elsewhere were striking for better pay and working conditions. And it's crucial to acknowledge this context in which early IO psychologists were working in order to grasp the social and political significance of their research and practice. This oversight can be addressed by looking at early 20th century radical socialist and labor movements, such as the IWW, to see how they were responding to workplace changes brought on by psychologists and other harbingers of scientific management. I'm also doing a critical history in the sense that I'm highlighting the critiques of management bias in IO psychology and the forms of counter research that were occurring alongside mainstream developments in the field throughout the 20th century. Vincher gives credit to the arguments about IO psychology's neglect of labor and unions, but he ultimately maintains that this bias was not necessarily a bad thing and that IO psychologists were nonetheless providing a valuable service. The question is, I think, whether the changes implemented by IO psychologists, even if well-intentioned, deterred from the goals of the labor movement to build worker power. I agree with Vincher when he laments that IO psychology has surprisingly little to say about the subjective experience of work. On this topic, I contend that IO psychology has operated with the underlying and unacknowledged assumption that work is good for people. So I'm historicizing this assumption by arguing that it is based in Max Weber's notion of the Protestant work ethic, which is the morality or ethos of capitalism that holds work to be virtuous and central to a good life. Weber reveals the historical origins of the work ethic in the medieval religious idea of a priestly calling to God. During the 19th century, via various Protestant denominations, the work ethic crossed from the monastic to the everyday realm, and the tenet was widely held that all individuals could become virtuous through vocational dedication to their work, which would make them more likely to receive salvation. In the Protestant formulation, work is the path to the afterlife. But over the course of the 20th century, in a secularized post-industrial context, work is now the path to individual self-expression, self-development, and creativity. From a genealogical perspective, and following Kathy Weeks, who I'm drawing on here, the work ethic has become so culturally ingrained that it appears natural and self-evident. Weeks aims to destabilize the work ethic by imagining a society in which the flourishing of individuals does not depend on work, and to this end is a proponent of basic income. While my dissertation draws on Weeks's work to call into question the work ethic, I am not outright opposing it as necessarily a bad thing, but rather asking whether it might be worth holding on to, albeit in new forms that are not tied to capitalist or religious ideology. So IO psychologists never explicitly discuss the work ethic, but it's assumed in the field that work helps people find meaning and fulfillment in their lives, and that it can be a form of self-expression. It is thought that jobs are a calling and that personality traits can be matched with specific jobs. At times, religious language is invoked in the psychological literature, with the claim, for instance, that there is a transcendent summons to careers. But even in those cases, neither Weber nor the Protestant work ethic is referenced, indicating a historical blind spot. We know that for a large portion of the workforce, especially those who are not white collar, but are in the manufacturing or service industries, this does not apply. Instead of being happy and fulfilled by their work, individuals are more often alienated. Although alienation is a relatively common topic among philosophers and social scientists, the term is rarely, if ever, referred to in IO psychology literature, which is ironic given the concept's delineation of the psychological effects of work. So I'm just going to talk briefly some of the figures I'll be highlighting, and this is an example of a few of the people from the history of like the counter research in IO psychology who are kind of like supporting labor and pushing back against the mainstream a bit. So Walter Dill Scott, he was one of the first American industrial psychologists. He started one of the first consulting firms called the Scott Company, and he was a proponent of unions and workers' rights, and he refused to work with companies who didn't support workers or labor. And he wrote a book called Labor Relations and Industry in 1925. Charles Myers was a really famous figure in British industrial psychology who thought that the ease of the worker was more important than productivity and efficiency. And he thought that industrial psychology should include labor management relations. Franziska Baumgarten, she was a Polish industrial psychologist who later moved to Switzerland, and she examined the field of industrial psychology as it existed in Nazi Germany in some of her later work, which is really interesting. And she was deeply concerned with factory working conditions, and she saw industrial psychology as a route for remedying these conditions instead of political activism. And she has been described as the conscience of psychology by a German psychologist. And then Arthur Kornhauser, he was kind of an icon in the field, a small field of critical industrial organizational psychology. He was adamantly vocally pro-labor. He was explicitly critical of psychologists for always being biased towards management. And he actually did research with workers in factories, and he was involved in the labor movement. And then Elton Mayo, who people might be familiar with, he's famous for the Hawthorne studies, which found that workplace productivity improved with any intervention by a researcher, which he thought showed that workers just wanted to feel like they were being listened to and considered. So Elton Mayo really brought the kind of therapeutic culture that was burgeoning in the mid-century of the time. He brought that to the workplaces, and this was kind of when HR departments kind of got ushered in. And Kurt Lewin was working around the same time, and he was doing participatory research in factories. So I separated those last two off because their work kind of marked a shift in the beginning of IO psychology and the humanistic, therapeutic, worker-focused approaches that have since then shaped the discipline. So So arguably, workplace reforms implemented by psychologists and others have functioned to quell labor unrest and deter from the labor movement's goals. There is a question of whether there can be a psychology of work or labor, or critical Marxist psychology, or if this is an oxymoron, because IO psychology was born out of a perceived need to adapt workers to capitalist structures. It may be the case that psychology, consisting of white-collar experts who focus only on individual-level problems, is not able to meaningfully advance a pro-worker or anti-capitalist agenda. And if it could, the question arises as to if we would even want that. Is the infusion of more psychological experts into the realm of labor desirable, or is it a form of psychologization that should be avoided? Psychology creates a need for itself and produces relationships of dependency. It does not always foster self-determination and agency. My goal is to imagine a new psychological discourse that helps workers without making them dependent on continuing external support. One of the purposes of the dissertation is to test the limits of psychology and to see whether, by its own internal logic, it can be refashioned as a tool for the self-mastery of workers and put in the service of radical or social causes. If a reordering of the internal structure of psychology is required to achieve these aims, this could portend the corruption of the discipline as we know it, with the logical outcome being its demise. But this remains to be seen. As someone who wants to be an expert, it is important that I think through how I can do this in a way that fosters worker independence without relying on the traditional psychological tools and frameworks. It's an exploratory investigation, which I hope is the initial stages of future collaborative work. And the dissertation is, ironically, central to my own project of finding a vocation. And that's it. Thank you.